Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first ever online summer school. If this is the first course that you've attended, then I want to extend the first welcome. If not, then I thank you for your patience in putting up with all our teething problems here at summer school, and I just would like to thank you for understanding that this is our first ever online summer school, and we apologize for all the teething problems so far. Let me, without further ado, say a few words of introduction. Professor John Higgins was Professor of English and the Ardeen Chair and holder of the Ardeen Chair in the English Department. He's also a member of the Academy of Science in South Africa. He is the author of the award-winning study Raymond Williams, Literature, Marxism and Cultural Materialism. And most recently, he published Academic Freedom in a Democratic South Africa. His work and teaching has always encouraged a close reading of text and has inspired deep reflection. As a teacher and supervisor, he's well respected by his students, who all of them paid fantastic tribute to him when he retired last year. Professor Higgins belongs to a generation of expatriate scholars who, in the mid-1980s, made the deliberate choice to place at the service of this university their intelligence, expertise, and political consciousness at a time when we were all under siege by apartheid. He received his training at King's College, Cambridge, and also at the School of Higher Learning in Paris. I'm not going to try and pronounce the French, John. You can translate. So I've looked up the English words for the, which I'm not going to try and pronounce. So Professor Higgins is particularly known for his decision to engage with the nature, content, and function of English studies from the standpoint of post-Marxism in South Africa. So I hand you over to John.
Thank you, Zuleika. École Normale Supérieure was the wonderful institution I was able to attend for a while.
And if I may just add that that is the same school that well-known and famous philosophers and scholars have attended.
Yeah. I was very lucky to go there and then to work in Geneva for several years, so that French is my kind of second language. And that's kind of interesting for Hitchcock, as we'll see, as in many ways the reputation and centrality of Hitchcock to cinema was first asserted by in French film culture, which was very active, particularly in the 1950s, in creating serious attention to film and finding in Hitchcock's work a prime example of why film should repay serious attention. But I'll come to that in a moment. Let's just begin with today. I'm just going to talk about Hitchcock's relation to 20th century cinema and suggest that in many ways he embodies the heart of cinematic practice. And the first point around that to make is the familiarity of Hitchcock. I don't know if you recognize the little pencil drawing on the left, which for my generation and maybe some other generations was instantly recognizable as a kind of visual signature of Hitchcock. Hitchcock is one of the most well-known filmmakers of the 20th century. And a part of that reputation and well-knownness came from the extraordinary series of interviews conducted with Hitchcock by the French filmmaker François Truffaut, who described Hitchcock as the most complete filmmaker of all, an all-round specialist. He masterminds the construction of the screenplay, as well as the photography, the cutting, and the soundtrack, and he's even an expert at publicity. His genius for publicity was equaled only by that of the painter and surrealist Salvador Dali. And I give that quotation because it describes the mastery of Hitchcock over all elements of filmmaking, and includes in that an emphasis on publicity. Because, of course, what made cinema possible was a massive financial investment and the construction of an extraordinary global industry, dominated from very early on by the USA and perhaps still dominated by Hollywood. And I want to talk about cinema and the 20th century through the lens of Hitchcock and show two sides to that idea of cinema and its embodiment in Hitchcock. One side, if you like, the aesthetic and technical side of cinema in Hitchcock's place and contribution to the aesthetic and technical side of cinema, but also to suggest that we can't understand cinema unless we also understand something about fantasy and the popularity of cinema, the way cinema became, and perhaps still is through Netflix and Showmax, the world's fantasy screen. So those are the sorts of things I'll be discussing in the series of lectures, the two sides of cinema, the aesthetic stroke technical side of cinema and the cultural and fantasy elements of cinema. To get to that, though, the best place to start with thinking about Hitchcock and cinema is the ways in which, initially at least, cinema was not regarded as an artistic form, but only as a commercial one. And in being regarded in that way, it wasn't held to be worth serious attention. There are many, many statements from cultural critics disparaging cinema in the early 20th century. And I've just picked one from, someone very influential in my field of study of literature, the British critic F.R. Leavis, who, alongside, many other famous cultural figures in the early 20th century, were really against cinema. And I mention this because Hitchcock is really important in being able to turn around those hostile feelings and to gain recognition not only for himself but by extension for cinema as something aesthetic, something artistic, something being worth interested in talking about and criticizing. But first of all, against cinema, you have a statement, for instance, like the following one from Leavis's extremely influential pamphlet of 1933, Mass Civilization and Minority Culture, in which he laid the grounds for the defense of a new form of study, English literary studies, to place against mass civilization and to emphasize the need for a minority culture. He writes specifically about film as something not really worth studying. Films have a very potent influence, he says. They provide now the main form of recreation in the civilized world, and they involve surrender under conditions of hypnotic receptivity to the cheapest emotional appeals, appeals the more invidious because they are associated with a compellingly vivid illusion of actual life. Films are mainly a means of passive diversion. That tends to make active recreation, especially the active use of the mind, much more difficult. Now, I want to say that Leavis is both, in a sense, right and wrong in his descriptions here. Certainly, cinema did deal with a compellingly vivid illusion of actual life. And as I'll be talking about later, they do offer something like conditions of hypnotic receptivity. But as Hitchcock was to show, and as many, many books of criticism and the establishment of film studies as a discipline has shown, there's much more there than the cheapest emotional appeals. You can be an active viewer of cinema. However, this is the backdrop against which Hitchcock struggled himself. One of the reasons he left Britain for the USA at the end of the 1920s was that films began to be taken more seriously in the USA before they were in Britain, and he felt quite upset that his artistry wasn't recognized in Britain because he made popular and commercial films. Hitchcock, from the beginning, set himself up to become an author, hence the signature that I showed you at the beginning. But it's not really until the 1950s that this association of cinema, of film with authorship becomes recognized and celebrated. The French journal Cahiers du Cinéma notebooks, or cinema notebooks, which began as a kind of review of current films and survey of older films, really was put together by a bunch of enthusiasts who all became filmmakers themselves. Truffaut, Chabrol, Jean-Luc Godard, Eric Romer, and others were all film aficionados who wrote for the journal, popularized film, and gradually themselves became filmmakers. Well, they had a special place in their heart for Hitchcock, and in October 1954, they devoted a whole special issue to Hitchcock, recognizing him as an author of cinema. In so doing, they spoke against, not explicitly but implicitly, the view of an F.R. Leavis, but also of many others, that film wasn't worth taking seriously. And the first plank in their argument for taking cinema seriously was to insist that films could have authors. Despite the many different people working on them, they could express the vision of a single created individual just as much as a poem did, a theatre piece or a novel. A few years later, drawing on things written in that issue of Cahiers du Cinéma, two filmmakers, Eric Romer and Chabrol, wrote a whole study of Hitchcock published in 1957, insisting that Hitchcock was one of the greatest inventors of form in the entire history of cinema. And this was followed up by a long series of interviews that Truffaut did with Hitchcock, published in 1983. Here, Truffaut wrote how American and European critics made him pay for his commercial success by reviewing his work with condescension. Every journalist I've spoken to asked me the same question. Why do the critics of Cahiers du Cinéma take Hitchcock so seriously? And the answer was Hitchcock was an artist. Film could be an art form. And Hitchcock was very aware of this idea of becoming an author of film. In 1927, as his filmmaking career was getting going, he presciently, in terms of his own career, insisted that when moving pictures are really artistic, they will be created by one man. He was already beginning to see himself as an author in the mode later described by the Cahiers critics. And I wanted to show you here very briefly just a thing how Hitch became known as Hitch. The affectionate abbreviation of his name was quite current by the 1960s. And how he used to sign his pictures by appearing in them, something which I think you're all likely to be familiar with. But let's just have a look at a few of those moments of that self-signing for which Hitchcock became famous, and how he appeared not in every film, but in many.
I just want to say that there is no sound on our end if you are playing that video.
Yeah, so there are many more. He's not in absolutely every picture, but that way of inserting himself into the film became a kind of signature of his authorship of the film. It helped with the public to make him a very popular figure, and in a piece of marketing to sign his pictures as Hitchcock pictures, to develop a cult of Hitchcock around him. By the time of Psycho in 1960, he even begins, because he's now become so well known, to introduce his films as part of the advertising campaign. Fabulous Mr. Hitchcock. So, as I say, you have a very concerted effort on Hitchcock's part to become known as an author of cinema, to own his works, to speak to the public about them, to insist on the artistry of his films. And we can kind of better grasp some of that through framing Hitchcock's work in relation to, a very, very brief history of 20th century cinema. Between 1880, in fact, and 1920, you have the gradual development of cinema as we know it, the invention and exploration of various forms of projection, various forms of putting films together, various places in which they were exhibited. Most famously in 1895, you have the films of the Lumiere brothers, which are often associated with the birth of the cinema, the entry of the train into the station, L'arroseur arrosé, the watering man watered. Later, we have Griffith's Birth of a Nation. In fact, there are many, many other hundreds of films being made in and through this period, all contributing to the eventual stabilization of ways of telling stories in film. And at the same time as the telling of stories in film, what is also important is how to get them out to the public. And it's a French company, Pathé, who first developed the model of virtual integration, in which film companies own not only the production of films, the making of the film, but their distribution and the venues for their exhibition. This is all consolidating, moving forwards towards a single kind of model in this first period of the origins of cinema between 1880 and 1920. From 1905, you have the Nickelodeons in the USA, cheap cinemas, only a nickel for entry, or not really cinemas, venues for showing films. And one of the person who invests in these first Nickelodeons, Marcus Lowe, begins to build up an actual chain of specifically theatres for movies by 1910, in misspelling on my part there. In 1919, he acquires Louis B. Mayer's Metro Pictures and Goldwyn Pictures in 1924, thus forming what is still a powerful player in the film industry, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, in 1924. So those are two sides of the film business, or three sides, not just for production of films, but their distribution and exhibition as well, all pulled together by these gigantic players in the film industry. On the aesthetic side, we have the development of the art of cinema in the silent period, really taking off after 1920 and between 1920 and around 1930, where you have in Russia the emphasis on montage and the new techniques of Soviet montage. You have the poetic cinema of French Impressionism, the hard poetry of German Expressionism, and the continued development of the Hollywood system towards world dominance between 1920 and 30. 1926 to 1927, sound is gradually introduced and it becomes standard in US films by 1929, helping to put forward the increasing global dominance of Hollywood. You can see that in financial terms as the investment in film between 1922 and 1930 grows from $78 million to an extraordinary $850 million US, as Hollywood begins also to take on a global market. It's from the 1930s that you have colour gradually introduced, although earlier cinema had various experiments with colouring in film and so on. These are mainly developed by one specific company called Technicolor, which owned all the patents, made sure it owned all the patents, and became, the firm became known as the thing in itself. Technicolor became Technicolor. And of course, more recently, in our recent history, you have the arrival of video, digital, and streaming devices. Netflix was founded in 1997. In 2018, the great US director Steven Soderbergh shot his film in Unsane on an iPhone 7. And we are today now experiencing some interesting things with cinema, as I'm sure many of you are watching films on Netflix and other companies. COVID-19 has shut down most cinemas through 2019. They opened up a little bit now, and there's been a significant delay of theatrical releases. The theatres themselves are obviously not making much money, and there's a question of whether the model of production, distribution, and exhibition, which started 100 years ago, is going to hold in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. In this history, Hitchcock work played a significant role and an extraordinarily innovative role. Before becoming a director with Malcolm Balkan, Hitchcock worked in cinema originally on writing the intertitles, which were an important part of narrating film in the early period. He began to work on the larger script of the narrative of the stories and the details of mise-en-scène, background, production values, and so on. And he gave quite a lot of work to various films before The Lodger, his first completely directed film, was made. So he had that all-round experience which Truffaut noted and emphasized. He worked in almost, as it were, every job in cinematic production and had a real mastery of the craft and was absolutely fascinated by it. Not surprisingly, Hitchcock made one of the first and most successful of the early sound films with Blackmail in 1929, recognized by Thompson and Bordwell's Film History as one of the most imaginative early sound films. And I'd like to just play, if I can, a sequence from that. Is that possible? Sorry. Again, this is new to me. Lorato, can you help with this, maybe?
Yes.
God. No, go back. Okay, Lorato, can you help with showing this slip? But just to continue while we struggle with that. In 1948, the film Rope was made in what appeared to be a continuous 10-minute, a continuous take. In reality, was 8 continuous takes, where Hitchcock realized he was breaking with his own theories on montage, but wanted to do so just to see what was possible. So Now, what's really important here is that while Hitchcock is one of the first to use sound, it's still subordinated to the visual narration. So much is made here of the subjectivity of the young girl who's just knifed somebody and her reactions to what is being said. But it's done visually as much as through sound. Hitchcock retains the craft of visual montage as sound comes into cinema. And it was widely noted that the advent of sound made many filmmakers much weaker in terms of visual narration. It's either move to close up.
I don't know if there's results.
So there you have a very interesting mixture of reality and fantasy as the sound is used in an exaggerated fashion to represent the emotional turmoil and psychic turmoil of Anne. Okay, thanks. Rope, as I say, was a really avant-garde use of single-take cinema. In 1949, Hitchcock demonstrated his mastery of cinema by taking one 9-minute continuous take of a speech by Ingrid Bergman. Recalling the experience, Ingrid Bergman noted, "It was the only time I broke down and cried on a movie set. I think Hitch did all this to prove to himself that he could," not making her cry, but having a 9-minute continuous take of somebody speaking. Also, Hitchcock wasn't afraid to continue experimenting. In 1954, he made one of the first three-dimensional movies, Dial M for Murder. And in 1960, you have kind of the apotheosis of this inventiveness in the famous Murder in the Shower of Psycho, a sequence around which Hitchcock said the best way to do it is with scissors, referring at once and the same time to montage, the cutting of film, and scissors being used for murder. Not in this scene in Psycho, but it's just a kind of pun he makes. So Hitchcock is fully involved with the development of 20th century cinema. He was innovative in his own terms. He took advantage of all the new developments, but as he did so, he continually controlled them. He used sound within the visual montage in Blackmail in order to give that emotional life of one of the characters, which he saw as cinema's strongest point. For Hitchcock, it was the visual montage and the montage of all the other elements of music and sound within that, which was really the key to cinema. We have, he says, a rectangular screen in a movie house, and this rectangular screen has got to be filled with a succession of images. That's where the ideas come from. One picture comes up after another. The public aren't aware of what we call montage, or in other words, the cutting of one image to another. They go by so rapidly so that they're absorbed by the content that they look at on the screen. So for Hitchcock, the artist, Hitchcock, the author, the writing which he performs is essentially a writing through montage. And in this, he recapitulates the history of cinema and the particular ways in which montage is gradually focused on as the key to cinematic art. One of the first people to really theoretically identify this and name it and put his finger on it was the Russian filmmaker Kuleshov, where in the very first film school ever established in the world, the Moscow Film School of 1919, in his classes in the Arab room, so-called, because it was furnished with cushions and rugs of an Eastern and Oriental kind of nature, Kuleshov insisted on montage, on the defining characteristic of this new art of cinema. An art, he said, must have the power to impress, and in the cinema, this power is conferred by montage. Montage is the essence of cinema, the essence of structuring a motion picture. And Kuleshov was famous for the famous Kuleshov experiments, which he used in educating the new generation of filmmakers. The Kuleshov effect, as it came to be known, although these are supposed to be moving pictures, not still pictures, was he'd show, for instance, this basic montage, which is the juxtaposition of one image with another in order to create a third meaning. You see the actor in close-up Kuleshov. The next image is a bowl of soup. Kuleshov says that when you see the image of the actor again, you read his expression as one of hunger, even though his expression hasn't actually changed. Similarly, when you see the actor, a girl's body in a coffin, you see his face again, the spectator reads that face now as expressing an emotion of sadness or loss. And similarly, in a third sequence of film, montage film, you see the actor, you see a young woman laying languorously on a sofa, you read the actor's expression as one of lust. The point is, the expressions don't change, but the interpretation of those images by the spectator changes because of a juxtaposition enabled by montage. The spectator creates the meaning through the act of montage. Following Kuleshov and Pudovkin, Eisenstein takes up the topic of montage and is perhaps the greatest theoretician of it, alongside the French-Swiss filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard. And he's obsessed with montage throughout his life, just as much as Hitchcock is. And the key problem or element in Eisenstein's work is whether montage is best understood as coercion or as creation. In 1938, he notes that it's the montage principle, as distinct from the depictive principle, which forces the spectator himself to create and thereby releases that great force of latent creative excitement within the spectator, which distinguishes an emotional work from informational logic of a plain exposition of events. And very like Hitchcock here, what is crucial is that montage is used to create emotion within the spectator, or to get the spectator to create the emotion through his interpretation of the montaged film. As I put it in a recent article, Eisenstein's language is one always of aggression and conquest in this account of montage. Cinema, he says, is above all a tool to exert an influence on people. The aim of montage is to deliver a series of blows to the consciousness and emotions of the audience, to subjugate it, to influence the audience in the desired direction through a series of calculated pressures on the psyche. Eisenstein, working in Soviet Russia, saw montage as essentially a tool of propaganda to control the thoughts of the spectator. But even within the Soviet Russia of the time, there was some opposition to this coercive idea of montage and an emphasis on its creative possibilities. In this, Eisenstein's great opponent was the filmmaker Dziga Vertov, whose Man with a Movie Camera you can find on YouTube and you might like to look at as one of the most avant-garde experiments in cinematic practice of this early period. Against Eisenstein, Vertov insisted on the capacity of spectators to make meaning for themselves. He opposed Eisenstein's idea of the collusion of the director as magician and a bewildered public. Instead, he insisted we need conscious people, not an unconscious mass submissive to any passive suggestion. And citing Lenin for the sake of ideological consistency, he sides with the practice of the popular writer who teaches the reader to go forward independently, as opposed to the Einsteinian vulgar writer who hands out ready-made all the conclusions of a known theory so that the reader does not even have to chew but merely to swallow what is given. Hitchcock occupies a position somewhere between these two extremes of montage as coercion or creation. What he insists on is the idea of montage creating a state of suspense in the mind of the reader, one in which the reader stroke spectator of the film gets involved, wants to know what's happening next, forms hypotheses from the materials given, and is involved in a creative act in the watching of the film, not just a bludgeoned spectator as we have in Eisenstein's theory, but a creative co-participant in creating the meanings of the film. As Truthow put it, suspense is simply the dramatization of a film's narrative material, the most intense presentation possible of dramatic situations. Suspense is created through the montage, and as Hitchcock emphasizes, it's essentially an emotional process. You give the audience information, and this is very different from the mystery, when the spectator knows less than the characters in the movie. Suspense is when the spectator knows more than the characters in the movie. In the end, there's no terror in the bang of an explosion. There's terror only in the anticipation of it. And Hitchcock's films use montage to keep the spectators in suspense, to keep them co-creating the meanings of the film. Montage, then, is the key to cinema. It's the way of creating meaning for spectators, or getting the spectators to create meaning for themselves. Hitchcock is the avowed master of montage in cinema, and therefore has such a central role in the history of 20th century cinema. That is then the technical side, or the technical stroke aesthetic side of 20th century cinema, the domination of montage, with Hitchcock exemplifying the work and practice of montage in cinema. But I said that as well as the aesthetic and technical side of cinema, all those inventions of sound and color, of fast editing, cross-cutting, parallel montage, rhythmic montage, many different forms of montage that were created through the century. There was also another side to cinema, which it's worth considering when we consider a filmmaker like Hitchcock, and that's filling in some of the substance of what the emotion is in relation to cinema, the psychic dimension of cinema, the feeling side of cinema, and being a spectator. And here, Hitchcock is held by many, as we'll see as we discuss inputs by Slavoj Žižek and others in the next lectures to come. This emotion is to be understood in relation to the special nature of cinema, the watching the film in the darkened rooms of the cinema with people, but also separated from them, even more so in COVID, and entering a particular, almost dreamlike state. This is what really interested many, not practitioners of cinema, but many theoreticians of cinema from the beginning. What was film? It depicted things through filming them. So the things that were films had to be there in the first place, so they had to be real. But the way you presented the film could be fictional, could be even science fictional, could be surrealistic. You could create something more than the real through film. Film, well, was it really more like a kind of hallucination? That's what critics like Leavis feared, that it would weaken the grip on reality of the spectator. But another way of putting that weakening the grip on reality was to open up consciousness to the unconscious. And it's interesting to see that in 1899, let's just go back. Freud, in one of his earliest essays called Screen Memories, talks about the work of perception and memory and this confusion of fantasy and reality, which you have in Screen Memories. Unfortunately, there's no time to go into that today, but what I just wanted to point to was the wonderful productivity of the English translation of Freud's essay, Screen Memories, as a screen is both something which conceals something, which is the meaning of the original German term in Freud's writing, but a screen in English is also that onto which you project something. And it's that double-sidedness of hiding and presenting, which is held by many to be the essence of cinema in its cultural and subjective dimensions. In other words, it's not surprising that of all the main filmmakers in the 20th century, Hitchcock is very consciously interested not just in the drama of subjectivity for the point of telling stories through montage, but he's interested in the depths of subjectivity and kind of brings the new science of subjectivity, psychoanalysis, directly into his films. From Spellbound to Marnie to Vertigo to Psycho, Hitchcock proves himself to be interested in psychoanalysis and the probing of it, and to have a real interest in the kind of relations between cinema and the dream state. As we can see in this wonderful clip where I don't think it's actually Freud who's playing the doctor in this clip, but looks remarkably like him. Yes, so Spellbound, all Hitchcock's films are interesting, but one of the most fascinating, I think, for understanding this collusion of the new culture of psychoanalysis, the new attention to the unconscious, and its close relation to cinema. Hitchcock hires Darley, that other great publicist, to create the dream sequence with its montage-like scissors cutting across the eyes, as in Buñuel and Darley's film An Andalusian Dog, a famous sequence from there. The cinema can be like the dream, or it can show the dreams in a way which the written word cannot. We don't have time to watch a famous sequence from Vertigo, but when you get the slides, you can easily find that for yourselves. What I want to suggest then this week as we go forward is we'll be looking at these two dimensions of film in Hitchcock's work, the two essential dimensions of cinema itself. On the one hand, the technical and aesthetic side, the use of montage, the development of an arsenal of communication through cinema. And on the other side of that, the emotional content, the emotional aims, the ways in which cinema can present both the real and behind the real, the unconscious. It's that bringing together of the two dimensions which makes Hitchcock's cinema so striking, so powerful, and so still watchable today, almost 100 years since Hitchcock's first film, The Lodger, which we'll be talking about in a little more detail, along with the 39 Steps tomorrow. Thank you for coming to this online lecture. I apologize on behalf of the team for some of the difficulties in getting into the session, but I'm presuming that tomorrow we won't be having any problems. As we did start a little bit late, I'd like to just have a few minutes now in case anybody wanted to make a comment, ask a question, or just say anything else. So, Lorato, I'm